everybody. Thank you for joining us for the fourth event of the Climate and Community Resilience Lessons from the Soil webinar series. The topic today is Systems Collapse, Climate and Ecological Crises. And we will be hearing from Stephen Leslie and Sarah Cohen. Some logistical things first. We have set up this Zoom meeting to keep your video cameras and microphones off for the first portion of this event. This is to keep technological disruptions and distractions to a minimum as best we can. We will have two presentations today, after which there will be a chance to turn on your video cameras. Please do that according to your comfort level. This series is being recorded, so you will have access to it later on as a reference. That also means that we ask you to stay mindful of the fact that you are being recorded once we get to the group discussion part later on in this event. If you would like to change the way that your name is showing up on the screen, you can do that at any time. If you right-click on the box on your Zoom screen that represents yourself, there should be an option to rename yourself by typing in something new. We have enabled the chat function on Zoom, so if you have any questions or concerns throughout the event, please type those into the box and someone from our team will try to assist as best we can. Please also note that with the chat box, the default is to send the message to everyone, so keep that in mind when sending a message. You can change this as you'd like to send messages to specific people. We are hoping that you will use the chat box to ask your questions. If you have a question for our speakers, please type into the chat box to everyone. We ask that you start your question with a question mark and then type your question into the box. If your question is for a particular person, please also make that clear. We may be combining similar questions to be efficient with our time. Towards the latter portion of the event, we may be using breakout rooms for discussion depending on how many people remain on the call, and we will provide some guidance on how to use those once we get there. With all of that information, we hope you are settled in and feeling comfortable with the technology. Thanks so much for joining us. To begin with, I will be reading a land acknowledgement provided to us by Don and Jonna Moody of the Winter Center for Indigenous Traditions. Just so everyone knows, the text of this acknowledgement is posted on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website. I know many people have already accessed that document and are planning to use this information in their work moving forward. So thank you, Donna and John, for sharing this acknowledgement with us. When Indigenous peoples in the Americas travel to other Indigenous nation homelands, it is a common courtesy since ancient times to acknowledge the Indigenous nation and peoples whose homeland we are gathering on. For the purposes of this series, being broadcast and watched from the Wombatuck or the White River on the ancient grounds of the Wombatuck Odanak, the White River Village, and Indakana, our land, we are gathering in the middle of this ancient nation homeland, which includes Vermont, New Hampshire, northern Massachusetts, western Maine, and southern Quebec. The Alnonbak, or the people, as they are called in Alnonbaiwi, the Abenaki language, have also been called the Wobanakiak, the people of the East or Dawnland, or the Abenaki since ancient times by Indigenous relatives in the East and Indigenous peoples as far away as Hopi and Diné, or Navajo, country, all the way to present-day Alaska and Tierra del Fuego in South America. Today, we are convening online from the sovereign homeland of the Abenaki nation and people. Abenaki traditions speak clearly of being created here in the beginning. Though archaeologists and linguists, as recently as the last 40 years, have stated that the Abenaki and all of their Algonquin language group relations from California and the High Plateau to the Plains, to the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, to the Maritimes, and down to Virginia are no more than 1,500 years old. And some more recently have stated that the Abenaki may be related to Indigenous peoples who are documented here for 9,000 years, a date that keeps moving back, given the major Abenaki site recently documented in Keene, New Hampshire, which is dated to the mid-13,000 before present time period. The Abenaki peoples themselves, along with many of their cousins in the Northeast, state unequivocally that we have always been here and we will always be here. From ancient times down to 1760, the Abenaki nation, which included numerous villages and thousands of extended families, was an independent native nation centered in their homeland, recognized by all other native nations and the British, French, Dutch, and other European colonizers. Though some parts of the homeland and the seacoast of New Hampshire and Maine, southern Vermont and New Hampshire, as well as northern Massachusetts, were shared with the encroaching English colonists from the 1630s on, most of the original homeland has never been sold or given away. In the American Revolution, George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, Jacob Bailey, Timothy Bedell, Moses Hazen, and many other leaders of the American resistance agreed with the Abenaki and their cousins, the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy of Maine, that they would retain their villages and homeland in exchange for helping in the defense of the northern frontier against the British. The ancient villages of Missisquoi in northwestern Vermont and the Coasec-Coas in the upper Connecticut River Valley were both explicitly acknowledged as Abenaki villages of long standing, which would remain in Abenaki hands in perpetuity. The Penobscot and Passamaquoddy nations retained 3 villages in Maine after the Revolution, after a tremendous 30-year struggle down to 1800. In Abenaki country, the word of the new American colonials was not kept. So the Abenaki nation was largely driven underground in the 1760 to 1800 time period. The people have remained in every town and watershed in the homeland right down to the present day. In the 1970s, the Abenaki nation of Missisquoi and the Coasec Abenaki of the Coasec Traditional Band of the Sovereign Abenaki Nation stood up in northwestern Vermont and the upper Connecticut River Valley. They formed the Abenaki Nation Coalition, with many Abenaki extended families and communities to protect and care for the people in the homeland, as well as to facilitate the protection of Abenaki burial grounds and sacred sites, and to return Abenaki burials, grave goods, and sacred items back home for reburial. In 2008, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Federal Acknowledgement Project rejected the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi petition for federal recognition with extensive involvement of the Vermont Attorney General's office. In 2011 and 2012, the Vermont legislature acknowledged 4 Abenaki communities, including the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi, the Elno tribe, the Nulhegan tribe, and the Coasec Band of the Coas. The original Coasec Traditional Band of the Sovereign Abenaki Nation, which is still based in Thetford, Vermont, was blocked from being acknowledged by the Vermont legislature in 2016 and by 3 of the 4 new tribes. Chief Nathan Pirro of this group was one of our speakers at event 2. In addition, the Abenaki Nation of New Hampshire and the Coasec Band of Pennacook Abenaki people are long-term Abenaki groups, which are also not state or federally recognized. There are hundreds of Abenaki extended families in this area and the wider nation homeland and beyond that are still here. In Canada, there are 2 Abenaki Nation communities at Odanak and Wolanak, which are both federally recognized in Canada as First Nations. We want to acknowledge the ancient Abenaki nation and people. We are aware that countless newcomer families in this area and the wider region were given indigenous seeds and plants, shown the ways of sogalikon, or maple sugaring, introduced to many crucial technologies and ways of living, from canoe, toboggan, snowshoe, and basket making, to ways of farming, fishing, trapping, and living, along with caring for the land, waters, and air in a good way, which are still widely practiced in the Abenaki homeland. We hope that we will learn to better care for the land and waters here in partnership with the many Abenaki Nation peoples in a respectful way. Thank you again, Donna and John Moody, for this acknowledgement. And now I will send it over to Kat.
Just a little reminder for anyone that's just joined us, please use the chat box if you have any questions throughout the event. There are a ton of resources posted on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website that you can explore, and the recordings of previous events are also posted there. I want to take a moment to thank our organizational sponsors who have been working with us collaboratively all winter to bring this series to you, which was originally supposed to be in person, and we quickly shifted to an online format for you. I want to give a really big shout out to the co-op food stores, Hanover Food Co-op and Upper Valley Food Co-op, who are right now our online, our frontline communities of people making sure that we're fed. And thank you all so much for the work that you're doing and for being a part of this series and organizing. And Vital Communities has been amazing. Bale, building a local economy in Royalton, Extinction Rebellion, Upper Valley, Grow More, Waste Less, and Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. We have really enjoyed working together to bring you this series. Please make sure to thank all of these guys when you shop at their stores or help their businesses or get involved with their projects. They're all incredible, and we hope to continue working together well into the future. We also want to thank our financial donors, our sponsors for this event, who have generously provided funds to make sure that everyone who's participating in the series gets paid for their time, for their effort, for their knowledge, and their service to their community. These businesses are incredible organizations. They have been supportive of so much work that we've done with Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. So take a good note of the logos that you see on the screen, and please support all of these businesses and organizations. Go check out their websites, see the work that they're doing in the world. They're all really incredible, and we're so grateful for their participation in this event. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kat. I want to also do a quick shout out to Chelsea Green Publishing, who has provided a discount code for all of the people who are attending this webinar series. You can get 35% off all of the titles online by using the code BALE35, B-A-L-E 35, which is on your screen right now. And with that code, you should buy some of these books that Chelsea Green has recommended for this event. For this event 4, they recommended Surviving the Future, Walking on Lava, What Then Must We Do, and Human Scale Revisited. And in addition to those 4 titles, Stephen Leslie, who is one of our presenters today, also has written 2 books for Chelsea Green, and we will send you those links during his presentation today. In addition to this list of books and the discount code, Chelsea Green has also donated a set of books that will be raffled off during event 6 of this series. That's the final event in May. You can get a raffle ticket by filling out the event surveys that go along with each of these webinars. The surveys are posted on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website alongside the recordings of each event. They are also in the chat box right now for you to fill out later. Your feedback will be used to improve this and future events. We have made a survey up for each event, and so please do fill it out as you are able. The more surveys you fill out, the more chances you'll have to win during the raffle.
On our website, you will also find a place to donate to this series to help all of our organizational sponsors pay the remainder of the bill after our financial donation. So if you're appreciating this work, please consider donating to the series if you are able to do so. We really appreciate that. And you see on the screen here where the big red arrow is pointing on the event page for the Climate and Community Resilience series. Look for the green donate button, and that money will go right to the Soil Series Fund being housed by Vital Communities, our fiscal agent and collaborator on this event. All of these events will be webinars. We had originally planned, of course, to do all of these events in person, and they were going to be a lot longer with lots of time for community discussion. We've modified so that we can minimize our screen time, still give you the great information, and provide some time at the end of the webinars to do chat rooms, which have been working out pretty well. We hope you'll stick around and join us for those at the end of the event. So all of the events are up on your screen. All of the Zoom links for these events are located on the website, and we intend to keep those links going as long as we're able to. So if you have any questions about how to join the future series or how to find webinars, you're not finding them on the website or something, just let us know by email, or you can type something in the chat now if you have a question about that.
Today we will hear from Stephen Leslie first, and then we will have some time for questions for him. And after that, we will move on to Sarah Cohen-Wood with questions for her after that. And then lastly, we will move into a group discussion, either as one big group or into smaller groups, breakout rooms, depending on the numbers. Please do whatever you need to do to feel comfortable during this webinar. These events are for you. If you need to leave early, step away for a phone call or a crying child, or if you need to take some space to digest information, please do so.
I want to provide you with some context for the series. This entire series seeks to explore the idea that what is good for the soil is good for communities. By this we mean that healthy, vibrant, biodiverse, functioning landscapes can teach and remind us as humans how to connect, collaborate, and appreciate the value of every aspect of our world. On the screen before you now are the soil health principles designed by the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The top 4 bullet points were designed by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The 5th one was designed by one of my heroes, Gabe Brown, who is a rancher from North Dakota. He has a book out called Dirt to Soil. I highly recommend checking that out. And if you get the audio version, you get to hear him narrate, which is really special. The 5th one, Slow and Sink the Water, happens if the first 5 are in place, but it's so important that we put it on our slide, and it's something that we like to educate about when we talk about the soil health principles. We have the soil health principles in detail up on our website, Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, and I highly recommend that you go and check those out. The soil health principles are something that I designed, and I want to invite you to create your own soil health principles. These have always been important to us, and perhaps now more than ever as we draw ourselves in and seclude ourselves from the rest of our community physically. Staying grounded, welcoming physical and philosophical diversity, keeping conflict to a minimum, protecting and nurturing yourself, getting in touch with the soil, getting out there and touching the soil and letting those microbes enter your body. And water is life. Water is life. We should all try and consciously embrace and embody the flows of energy. So again, I invite you to create your own soul health principles or follow these. Thanks for hanging with us through this opening. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren now for the next portion.
Thanks, Kat. I also wanted to add that Stephen Leslie will be talking a little bit more about the soil health principles during his presentation today as well. With this series, we hope that everyone becomes aware of the resources and knowledge within the Upper Valley and the larger Vermont and New Hampshire communities. At the same time, we want to recognize that the speakers in these events do not have all of the answers. We are all collaborators in this lifetime, and we need to work together and pool our resources and knowledge. We need to support each other, and we need to support Earth's systems as best we can. We also need to be thinking in whole systems. We do not want to get stuck on the elephant in the room's front leg, because that can make us forget that the elephant is running full speed ahead at us. We need to see the bigger picture and start asking better questions. We, as the organizers of this series called Climate and Community Resilience, Lessons from the Soil, came together because that is what we wanted to bring to our communities. We wanted to make sure that everyone understands the interconnectedness of our world and its systems so that we can make better choices. This means understanding how soil and climate and resilience are related to the military and medical industrial complexes, to land and resource access for all, and to the way that colonization, white supremacy, and patriarchal systems harm everyone and everything, while recognizing that they harm some much more than others, from certain human communities to soil microbes to natural wetlands and beyond. We want us to all recognize that the systems currently in place have led to these crises, and that we cannot use those same systems to move forward. We want to push comfort zones because what is convenient for some is detrimental to others. We all need to shift our thinking about the path forward because it isn't as easy as just learning how to grow your own food in your garden in your front yard, though that may be part of it. It isn't that simple because not everyone has access to land to have a front yard where they can install a garden large enough to feed their family. Not everyone has access to the time and resources required to grow their own food. Not everyone has access to food that is culturally and physically appropriate. And not everyone has the opportunity to even think about these ideas. It is a privilege and a great responsibility that should not be taken lightly. Yes, we can all do something, and none of us are powerless, but we need to move forward as whole communities together. Without first addressing these fatal flaws in our systems, we cannot begin to hope to build a regenerative culture or future in which the Earth's systems can re-equilibrate and climate changes can be slowed. Extinctions can be replaced with new species and adaptations, and some form of peace and sustainability can be implemented. We need to work towards justice in our communities and beyond first, because that is where real resilience can begin, with diversity of opinion, skill, lived experience, background, and need. We need to learn from the soil and from nature that competition and endless growth are not part of the way forward, but that collaboration and cycles are. We need to recognize the wrongs perpetrated on the soil, that of the wrongs done to microbes in industrial agricultural fields, but also to our human siblings who have been systematically and forcibly removed from access to those fields to feed their communities. For these reasons, we wanted the series to focus on justice. We recognize that oftentimes we've made mistakes and we are doing our best to learn from them. We hope that this series inspires you to learn more and to learn differently than you otherwise might have. We hope that this series starts messy, awkward, uncomfortable, well-intentioned, respectful, loving, empathetic conversations that push our societies towards a just transition to a regenerative future. We hope that this pushes us in some small way in the right direction. So to help us create a safe and enjoyable online environment for some of those difficult conversations, there are some things we would like to explicitly acknowledge. We want to acknowledge that the world is changing. There are multiple interrelated crises that require serious attention and collaboration, and humans have the opportunity to move forward from these crises and build a better world. In order to do this, we must all understand that oppression exists, everything has the right to live, everyone deserves to be heard. We keep in mind that we bring with us our working models of the world, and we are open to adjusting those. We all speak from our own lived experiences and worldviews. We are all willing to learn and to have those working models, lived experiences, and worldviews changed. If you have any additions for us for this list, please type them into the chat and we will consider adding them for our next event. The suggestions from last time and other feedback we have received has indeed caused us to rethink some of the information that we are providing and how we are providing it. We hope that we are meeting the needs of this community. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kat.
Thanks, Lauren. So we prepared this little video for you, and it's also available on our YouTube page. We encourage you to use that as often as you can for anything that you need to do it with. This flour and bread exercise was designed by Dee Dee Pershouse and Megan Wilson, who is a science teacher at Hartford High School. And it is found in written detail in Dee Dee's teaching manual called Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function. The link to that teaching manual is in the chat right now. It's a free teaching manual. It is what I use to build curriculum for elementary and middle school students, and people all over the world are using this curriculum. We hope that you'll do the same. Thanks.
We're looking at two landscapes here. On the red plate, this is a degraded landscape. It's flour as a stand-in for a degraded landscape, which is dirt, sand, silt, and clay, broken up rocks. On the green plate is bread, and it's a stand-in for a healthy landscape. It's sand, silt, clay, and biology. Super important. Let's see what happens when we rain on these landscapes. Pouring water into a rain cloud, of course, and the rain cloud is causing erosion. The rain is causing erosion. We see some runoff. There appears to be flooding. The color of that water indicates that the soil itself, or the landscape, is now a part of the water system. We have dry places all over the landscape, but yet there's flooding. This seems to be flooding and drought at the same time. If we were a plant in this landscape and there was a drought and places did not get water, it would be dry at the bottom. So let's see. We find a totally dry plate on the bottom. So if we're a plant in this landscape, our roots would not have just gotten a drink. We would be thirsty. Flooding, drought in the same place, poor water quality. If you were farming or gardening in this landscape or adding any type of household chemicals to this landscape, Those would now be in the waterway. Let's see what happens when we rain on a healthy landscape on the bread. The water is infiltrating into the sponge of the soil. It's soaking in like a sponge. Those pore spaces that hold the bread out are happening because yeast is the magic ingredient in bread, which is the biology in bread. That's what makes air spaces those organisms breathe. Those pores are held together in landscapes by the goose glues, snots, and slimes that are produced by biological soil organisms that live all throughout the soil landscape. Let's see what happens when we rain twice as much on this landscape, since we didn't see any flooding from the first rainstorm. These pore spaces make up about half of the space of soil, and they are where the air is in soil. It's where water can infiltrate into soil, and that air and water, along with photosynthesis and the sugars made by plants, sustain microbial life in the soil. So twice the amount of water, and we still have no flooding in this landscape. I'm going to pour a little more because I'm really trying to reach saturation here. Saturation will happen when we start to see water flow out from the bottom of this landscape, indicating that the water is going through the soil to the base layer. Soil is a filter, healthy soil. Biological organisms and chemical interactions with those organisms in the soil, in these pore spaces, in the sponge, actually clean water. If you had to live in these landscapes, would you choose the flour or the bread if you were a farmer? If you were growing plants of any kind, you would likely choose the bread. The bread is wet all the way through. We have full saturation. If these landscapes were out in hot, hot, sunny conditions for days after this rainstorm, this one would evaporate and get covered with a hard, crusty surface, would not take in water the next time it rained. This one would get a little stale on the outside, so to speak, because it's bread, and down in the middle you would still have some moisture, so organisms and plants in this landscape would still be able to get a drink. If you had to build a house in one of these landscapes, you would likely choose the bread. Your house here might be in the waterway. If you had to get water from natural sources in one of these landscapes, you would likely choose the bread because you might be able to find it after it rained and you would want to drink it, as opposed to this right after a rainstorm.
Hi, everybody. We're about to get started on today's programming, and I'm here to introduce Stephen Leslie, who, along with his wife, Carrie Gawalt, and his daughter, Maeve, manage Cedar Mountain Farm. It's a horse-powered CSA market garden and Jersey cow dairy located at Cobb Hill Co-housing in Heartland, Vermont. Stephen is the author of The New Horse-Powered Farm and Horse-Powered Farming for the 20th Century, both from Chelsea Green Publishing, right in White River Junction. You can access these books at the links that are in the chat. And don't forget to use the discount code BALE35 when you purchase those online. And now we're going to turn it over to Stephen.
Soil is life. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Stephen Leslie. My family has been farming in the Upper Valley since 1996. Cedar Mountain Farm is a micro dairy of 24 Jersey milking cows and a CSA market garden. I'm also a partner in Cobb Hill Cheese. We have been producing award-winning raw milk cheeses for 20 years. Our farm is located at Cobb Hill Co-housing. in Heartland, Vermont, a 23-household eco-village dedicated to sustainable living, forestry, and farming. We practice management-intensive grazing on 50 acres. Our market garden is horse and human-powered. Hoop houses allow us to extend the growing season for produce. We plant a diverse rotation of full-season cover crops undersown with cash crops, and catch crops at the end of the season. Farm-made compost is applied annually at a rate of 20 tons per acre. We have begun a transition to no-till. I became an organic farmer in 1992 as a response to what I then perceived as a farming crisis and ecological breakdown. To me, as a first world citizen, becoming a small farmer in North America seemed the most direct action I could take. I thought I was doing my bit to help forestall disastrous climate change when the October 2018 IPCC report on climate was released. It hit me like a bolt of lightning. I took a deep dive into the current science. I came away feeling like I wasn't doing enough, that I needed to join with others to effect decisive and immediate change. The words of a Swedish schoolgirl shot through my heart like a flaming arrow. One day, I was sitting in a brilliant crowd inside a darkened theater. My 12-year-old daughter and the rest of her dance company were on stage at a competition. They danced a comical piece, and yet I suddenly found myself uncontrollably weeping. At first, I did not know why. Then I realized I was weeping for all these beautiful children. I was weeping for Earth. I heard about Extinction Rebellion taking 5 bridges in London and turning the national conversation from Brexit to climate change. I joined the Nonviolent Revolution in Vermont. Extinction Rebellion united with others in a climate, migrant, and environmental justice coalition, youth leading the way. With creative, direct action, they brought the message of climate and ecological emergency to the chamber of the Vermont Statehouse and got everybody talking about it. I love being part of this movement. But it is a challenge to be a farmer and an activist. As time went by, I gravitated to the role of advocate for soil. The shift was complete when I met Australian climate scientist and soil microbiologist Walter Yenny, from whom I first heard about the soil carbon sponge and its ability to naturally and safely cool the planet. His message changed my life, landed me back on my own 2 feet and the soil beneath them. Before, I was rebelling out of a sense of desperation. Now the solutions seemed within reach. I'll explain what I learned from Walter and many others besides later in the talk. But first, let's take a look at how we have arrived at our current moment, the agribiz apocalypse. Tropical Storm Irene came as a wake-up call to all Vermonters. A lot of soil washed away with Irene. Farmers everywhere are on the front line of climate change. The Northeast is 20% wetter since 1970. Climate scientists predicted it will be 20% wetter again by 2050. Our crops and cattle are under stressors of extreme heat, drought, and precipitation events. We see new insects and plant diseases. Bats and swallows go missing from the sky. We experience unpredictable growing seasons. The USDA has reclassified our region from Zone 3 to Zone 4. In the middle of the country, in the spring of 2019, the Mississippi, Arkansas, and Missouri rivers all flooded. 20 million acres went unplanted. $20 billion was lost in profits. That same summer, 2.5 million acres of forest burned in Alaska. Georgia and North Carolina suffered drought and record-breaking heat. Worldwide, it was the hottest year in the history of humanity. In 2019, climate catastrophes around the planet dominated the news cycle. At current rates of soil degradation, groundwater depletion, and salinization, the Central Valley of California, where 40% of our produce is produced, will be a desert in 10 years. Globally, 30% of all arable land has been abandoned over the last 40 years. 25 million acres are abandoned each year. The FAO predicts that at current rates of worldwide soil loss, we have 60 harvests left. Dust storms have returned to the high plains. The last 3 years have witnessed scenes all too reminiscent of 1935. California now burns out of control during the rainy season. This past year, the Amazon in Australia experienced unprecedented wildfire holocausts. Famine played a major role in the uprisings of the Arab Spring and the Syrian Civil War. How many years before we face multiple breadbasket failures around the world? Social scientists tell us that civil order turns to rioting after 7 missed meals. The UN predicts as many as 700 million climate refugees will be on the move by 2050. People of the global south who have contributed the least and suffered the worst from what Bill McKibben calls the iron law of climate change. Our response must be to receive these people and offer them full and fair opportunity to contribute to our society. The farmers among them should be given access to land. The process of land degradation was set in motion 10,000 years ago when we made the transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists. Since then, humans have degraded half of the terrestrial land surface. Here in Vermont, land degradation began in earnest with European settlers 2 centuries ago. The invention of the machine loom, followed by the introduction of merino sheep, touched off a boom and bust in the wool industry. 80% of the forest was cleared by the 20th century. The rivers ran brown with silt. Half our soil was lost. And indeed, 1/3 of all atmospheric carbon released since 1750 has come from land degradation. Entire soil types are going extinct. We have removed animals from the land and placed them in confinement. Force-fed high soy and corn diets cannot survive in these environments without antibiotic-laced feeds. Their manure is a waste management problem. Only humans create waste. In natural systems, nothing is wasted. We grow monocrops for animal feed and ethanol on land that was once short and long grass prairie, teeming with life. We burn fossil fuels, store and truck feed over long distances. Soil once 10 feet deep swiftly erodes away. Not only our soil, our water is in trouble too. Eutrophication from unchecked urban runoff, sewage, detergents, and pharmaceuticals, along with farm runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from large confinement dairies, have created annual algal blooms. Vermont dairy farmers produce the same amount of milk now as they did in 1970. Back then we had 5,000 dairy farms. Today we have 650. Each year, 80,000 acres are planted to corn in Vermont. If all that corn was undersown in cover crop, it could sequester the carbon equivalent of removing 51,920 cars off of Vermont roads. Bare soil is 10 times more prone to erosion than under cover crop, 10 to 100 times more prone than soil under pasture, 1,000 to 10,000 times more prone to erosion than soil under forest. Original prairie soils have 10% organic matter or more. Ag soils in the US are typically lower than 1%. In the US, an average of 4 tons of soil is lost from every ag acre every year. That's 4 pickup trucks leaving every acre. The overall economic loss is valued at $37 billion. Degraded soils require chemical fertilizers and pesticides to prop them up. These products are repurposed munitions and toxic agents from the world wars of the 20th century. These biocides kill the soil microbiology and make crops dependent upon synthetic intervention. Cover crops and no-till are an improvement, but planted in monocrops, they lack biodiversity. Conventional no-till relies on GMO seed and glyphosate, which is classified a human carcinogen by the EU, and pollinator-killing nicotinoids, soil-killing chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Sick soil grows sick plants and animals and makes for sick people. So, what is to be done? Vermont lawmakers have put forth progressive legislation in the 2020 session. The Multi-State Transportation Climate Initiative, the Vermont Green New Deal, the recently passed legally binding targets to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation, weatherization, wind, solar, and hydro are all technological fixes. We must lower greenhouse gas emissions by technological means. But in a rural state like Vermont, are we looking in all the right places for the solutions we need? If it rained 8 to 11 inches in a 12-hour period back in 1800, the old growth forests of our region would have infiltrated that water with ease. No catastrophic flooding of our waterways. For every increase of 1% organic matter, a well-aggregated soil holds 20,000 to 27,000 gallons of water per acre. Soil just may be the key to surviving and even thriving in an era of abrupt climate change. The last 25 years have seen an explosion of new discoveries about the soil microbiome, particularly the role of fungi in regulating soil processes. We farmers used to think that humus formation was solely the product of decomposition. We now understand that photosynthesis grows soil through a mutualistic symbiotic relationship with microscopic soil flora and fauna. 30 to 70% of the liquid carbon sugars manufactured in plants are delivered to the microbes living in the rhizosphere in the form of exudates. Countless billions of fungi, bacteria, and beneficial nematodes thrive in this environment and deliver nutrients, minerals, and water to plant roots in exchange for carbon. This is how humus is formed. Our current practices are largely degenerative, and most of our incentives are misplaced. We need a just transition to shift our farms and forests over to regenerative land management. What would that look like? Here are some universal principles that we can follow to promote healthy soil in every context. Keep living roots in the ground. Minimize bare soil to maximize photosynthesis to keep the liquid carbon pathway active at all times. Soil cover increases organic matter. Soil cover protects against erosion. Minimize disturbance. Tillage burns up carbon and destroys the soil microbiome. Organic no-till creates a sink for carbon that restores the natural fertility of soils. Maximize diversity. Plant diversity stimulates greater microbial life and increases biodiversity at all trophic levels. Keep animals in contact with soil. Forage crops thrive under intensive management grazing. Planned grazing improves pasture and grows healthy livestock. Farmers and ranchers should receive training in regenerative practices. Dairy farmers should be incentivized to keep livestock at carrying capacity and get them back out on the land. On-farm and municipal composting can help put us on track to a circular economy and a zero-waste society. Healthy soil can sequester 3 to 10 tons of carbon per acre. It is estimated that if all 8.3 billion acres of rangeland and 3.8 billion acres of cropland on the planet were converted to regenerative land management, we could sequester enough carbon to bring CO2 in the atmosphere back down to 350 parts per million in just 5 years. The benefits of regenerative agriculture go far beyond carbon sequestration. At 90%, water vapor is the most prevalent greenhouse gas. CO2 is a mere 0.04%. 1 gram of soil carbon can hold 8 grams of water. We can restore the hydrologic cycle. restore the small rain cycles, cool the planet one microclimate at a time, mitigating both flood and drought while extending plant longevity. Every person owes their existence to soil. The human gut biome depends on the health of the soil biome. Just as the microorganisms in soil provide metabolites to plants, the microorganisms in our gut provide nutrition to our cells. Access to healthcare regularly polls as among the top concerns of Vermonters. If every citizen were dedicated to creating soil through the promotion of regenerative land management, we could sequester all the carbon we need to cool the environment, restore biodiversity, provide meaningful employment, and feed everyone nutrient-dense food. There is your universal health care. To build a resilient local food economy, we should establish price parity for farm products to ensure farmers and farm workers can earn a living wage. Institute regional supply management of farm products to keep pricing fair for small farmers. Establish cooperative markets and food processing hubs, and welcome migrant farm workers and ensure they receive equal rights and justice. Regenerative land management can cool the planet, restore biodiversity, and save humanity. But for any of that to happen, we need to understand that soil is the matrix of life, and as such is the very essence of the commons. Let's provide farmers with the training and incentives they need to transition to regenerative practices. We must not only reward farmers for ecological services, such as growing nutrient-dense food, providing cleaner air and water, and sequestering carbon. Land managers who are capable of growing topsoil while providing food, fuel, and fiber must be justly compensated in the same way that civil society supports all other infrastructure and basic service providers. Novel coronavirus is telling us many things. One clear message is that this global pandemic has the same root causes as abrupt climate change. We have created this situation through land degradation and loss of habitat. The predictable tragic outcomes of an unfettered capitalism that commodifies nature and externalizes environmental costs. On the other side of all this death and suffering, collapse of the global economy, we have before us a watershed moment for change on an unprecedented scale. We all have feet on the ground. This is the place to begin. Just as in the Great Depression, government will act to save our economy. We must be ready to lift our collective voices to ensure that change comes in the form of a Green New Deal, which recognizes habitat restoration as the basis of true societal wealth. It takes two wings to fly. We need to practice an engaged regenerative land management that equally prioritizes nonviolent direct action and hands in the ground practice. Soil is life.
That was wonderful, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I'm gonna see if I can fix my lighting here so people can see me. Okay. Hi, everyone. Please continue to type your questions for Stephen into the chat, and we're gonna do a little Q&A here. How much time do we have for Q&A, Lauren?
We have about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Hey, I see Chris Wood. Nice to see you, Chris Wood. Okay. So Stephen, I'm gonna start from the questions that we've just gotten in the chat and kind of work backwards. Can no-till farming be effective without the use of manufactured herbicides?
Yes, absolutely can. So if we're talking about on the home garden or market garden scale, then organic no-dig gardening is a wonderful creative way to work your ground, grow a super abundance of food, and build soil at the same time. And this practice does rely on either having your own farm-made source of compost or having access to materials to either buy in compost from another farm or to buy in materials to create your own blend of compost on your own property. But there's a plethora of these kinds of materials available in the in our locales. Often from municipalities, you can get leaf litter, yard waste, things of that nature. Of course, bring in straw or manure. Even oftentimes, horse barns are happy to have people come and take away manure from those kinds of sources. So, in short, no dig gardening, no till market gardening do require a lot of compost, but that's a good thing because we have so much food waste in this country right now that we need to do a whole heck of a lot more composting. The other part of the question on the large scale, for instance, can people grow corn or soybeans or cotton with regenerative organic practices? And the answer is yes. This is a cutting edge technology. If you want to find out more about it, go to the Rodale Institute's website, where they've been doing no-till trials for what we would call row crops or commodity crops. And they've developed roller crimpers for knocking down cover crops and then plant seeding with no-till drills directly into those cover crops. When you do that organically, it requires a lot of observation and timing to get the cover crops knocked down at just the right time. For instance, with rye, it's just at the flowering of the rye. But this is a leading edge of development that even so-called conventional farmers are interested in, because they can combine the roller crimpers with glyphosate use and significantly reduce their use of glyphosate by using the roller crimpers. As much as 85% of the kill of the cover crop can be affected by the roller crimpers, even on that large scale, and even 100% for people who are really getting it down. But generally speaking, they're finding they can use 15% of the glyphosate that they formerly were using without the roller crimper technology.
Thanks, Stephen. Along those lines, we did have another question about avoiding synthetic nitrogen for both soil health and climate impact. And I don't know if you wanted to speak a little bit towards that.
Well, sure, I can. I think both you and Kata, and is Sarah on as well with us at this point?
She is. I can turn on her mic.
Great.
Like we can turn on Sarah's mic. Actually, we didn't tell her that she was going to be on yet, so we'll wait a little bit.
Okay, sure. One of the things that we're looking at in regenerative land management is that nitrogen is super abundant. It's everywhere. It's Lauren, could you maybe have that data at your fingertip? It's like 85% of the atmosphere is atmospheric nitrogen.
78%.
78. Thank you. And so as Didi Pershaus and Walter Yenny and others talk about, Walter has this wonderful metaphor of creating cathedrals in the soil. And what we admire about cathedrals principally is that they create space. They create, in that sense, a sacred space. And so half of a well-aggregated healthy soil, as Kat mentioned earlier, is indeed air, and that air contains nitrogen. And if we have that healthy soil biome, then that nitrogen is being fixed into the soil and is then available through mycorrhizal fungi and through the life cycles of the bacteria to plants without any addition or anything being brought in by us to make that happen. So for instance, if we look at a healthy forest, nobody has to go around sprinkling nitrogen and phosphorus around in the forest to get the trees to grow. It's only because we've removed the plant cover and our agricultural practices are almost devoid of photosynthesis for large parts of the year, and then in a greatly reduced monocrop form during the so-called growing season. And so they're actually incapable then of fixing nitrogen through the photosynthesis process.
That's a great segue. Good answer, Stephen. Thank you. And it's a great segue to the next question. So the question is, do you have suggestions for how to maximize diversity in annual food crop gardening? And I'll just say, you know, I get this question a lot. I think it's a simple concept of maximizing diversity and maximizing photosynthesis, but yet it doesn't come easily, I think, for people to really understand that. So I'd love to hear how you would explain that to the sort of common gardener, homeowner. How do you maximize photosynthesis?
Okay, I'll answer that. I also just wanted to back up real quickly to say also on nitrogen that we need to understand that synthetic nitrogen is a highly fossil fuel intensive process for extracting it. And it is in fact a biocide. It is poisonous to the microbiology in the soil. And plants will then, kind of like an addict, take the direct shot of nitrogen or phosphorus in a soluble form, and the soil then is just acting as this medium to deliver. But I think just as an addendum to what we were talking about in previous, that actually understanding that nitrogen and then the runoff of nitrogen turns to nitrates, which are known to cause blue baby syndrome, cause cancers, disrupt the life of the soil, of the water cycle. So anyway, enough of that. But so not only is it not necessary in a regenerative management plan, but it's actually an incredibly counterproductive thing to be adding to this to the soil. And you know, we went to nitrogen because we had degraded soils in the mid-20th century, and the Green Revolution created these amazing super crops of rices and wheats that responded to synthetic fertilizers and gave this incredible boost of food production to the world. And it seemed like a miracle, but it was only because we were propping up already degraded soils with an intervention, a synthetic intervention that became worse than the existing problem of degraded soils, which needed to be regenerated, not further degraded through becoming addicted to chemicals. So anyway.
Yeah, I liken the green, you know, it's interesting, the Green Revolution. Well, first, I liken nitrogen and chemical fertilizers to like steroids. I once heard Tom Honingford, who's another one of my favorite farmers in the Upper Valley, Geo, use the reference that, you know, you can take steroids and you can look real good, you know, but like humans can, but systemically we're broken, we're very weak. And when you use steroids or chemical fertilizers, synthetic pesticides and fertilizers on your plants, it's the same thing. You can get like, you can look real good, but it's empty inside and you leave behind a wasteland, you know, systemically.
Right. The whole part about the lack of nutrition in the food grown that way is a whole nother sphere that we could touch on. But just in terms
likewise,
of
the Green Revolution is ironic, right? Because, you know, here we are, we're segueing into talking about how do we maximize diversity? How do we maximize photosynthesis? And those were not a part of the Green Revolution, which really wasn't so green in color or any other way.
Right, maybe green in the dollar signs, right? For a select few. So in terms of thinking about maximizing photosynthesis in our home gardens or small commercial gardens, one way we can think about it is in terms of geometric shapes of lances and kites and shields and stars. And so if we think about all these different leaf shapes and how they're all sort of placed at different heights, low to the ground, and creating canopies and trophic levels, even in a home garden, and all those different shapes and heights of the different plant families that we put together, just that's our maximization of how the plants are then absorbing we could say capturing or absorbing this incredible free energy from the sun. And so, you know, traditional ideas of companion planting or undersowing cover crops in a no-dig garden situation where you're working with that incredible fertility of adding, of using compost as a mulch, you can just fill every, you know, square inch of your beds with living growth, and you're going to have the fertility to have all that working together. If folks want to check out John Jevons' work, the biointensive method here of polycultures is really what we're getting at. And this is also traditional indigenous farming, like for instance the Mayan tropical garden, where you're recreating what nature does in terms of different trophic layers of canopies and mid-latitudes and ground covers, all producing food and services within that polyculture.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm just going to ask the next question. There's a couple that are kind of related. So the question would be that there's one community that's discussing using a large area of their land as a lawn versus a meadow. So they're not talking about growing food necessarily for humans. And they were wondering if you had any thoughts on that discussion and maybe lawn versus meadow.
Huh. Well, I'm not sure if by meadow they mean a grazing paddock.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah. Because as you know, like here in Vermont, if you're either mowing it or grazing it, or it's returning to forest, basically. So what we think of as a meadow still is a managed grassland if it's open. So somebody's either bush hogging it, or they're grazing some animals on it, or in some way modifying it so that all the little things that like to strike out of the forest as pioneers and start returning the ground to the woods would be there as soon as we left it for even a year.
So they chimed in. Thank you, Margaret. They're asking just to be mowed once a year, so it's not for grazing.
So Kat, what do you think about continuous mowing at a height that leaves sufficient regrowth versus just a single mowing to take off all the dead chaff and whatnot that of a single mowing that many landowners do who aren't having it hayed or grazed?
Well, as usual, when I answer questions, I'm going to refer to the soil health principles and also ask about the context. You know, how is the land used? What are the goals? Is it yours? Who else lives there in terms of a non-human species? How is it used by everyone else that's non-human? And what would be best for everybody? So once we've addressed those questions and kind of put it in that context, specifically, I would say, you know, finding, yes, mowing can stimulate growth. So like mowing once a year, you know, and brush hogging every few years to keep a field in its place, so to speak. That's us arresting succession. We're saying, you cannot progress to a forest, this piece of land, right? So where are we on that? Or do we ever want it to be a forest? Are we trying to promote pollinator habitat or beneficial insects? Or are we just trying to have a nice spot that looks nice to humans with lots of flowers? Or are we promoting deer? So you can stimulate root growth by chopping plants down. Our standard lawn of 2 to 4 inches is not really doing that. You know, you're really struggling. You're stressing the plants when you mow them lawn quality. When animals come through and it's done well, as you know, probably much better than I do, Stephen, animals produce enzyme, they have enzymes, and there's all this saliva there's actually all this interaction microbially that's happening, and the hoof action and the poop and the pee, that's not happening with a lawnmower. So grazing is super different than lawn mowing. So we're not going to get the same kind of stimulation. But again, it depends where you're trying to go. Are you trying to improve soil? You're trying to deepen roots? You're trying to make the sponge deeper? Is your soil clay-based? Are you on ledge? What's the aspect of the sun? These are all really important questions to be able to answer.
Awesome.
I'm going to ask the next question too, kind of off of that question and that discussion of this whole idea of animal product consumption and if it's sustainable, quote unquote, or regenerative in our landscape. There's obviously, it's a big debate and there's a lot of strong feelings on both sides. And Stephen, if you want to start, I know Kat and I probably both have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, sure. So I began my farming career back in 1992 as a farm apprentice at Hawthorne Valley Farm in Columbia County, New York. And I was there for 3 years, and I met my incredible wife, Carrie, while I was there, but that's a summer romance aside. But so during that 3 years, I was studying biodynamic farming, and the basic idea of biodynamic farming is that, at least in the northern latitudes, the cow is the fertility engine of the farm organism, as it's called. And as I looked into that deeper, I really came to understand this basic soil principle that there is no ecosystem on Earth without an animal component. And understanding that, then when we design our agricultural systems, we need to factor in the animal component one way or another. Even if you're a home gardener and you don't even keep chickens, but you're buying compost from the dairy farm down the road, you are including the animal component into the ecology of your garden. And so that's just the fundamental factor for us in how we look at managing the farm organism to optimal health and optimal diversity. And so here in Vermont, as we were saying earlier, the landscape naturally wants to be a forest. And we've removed the trees and then they've come back. And so now we're just maintaining a much smaller percentage of grasslands here in Vermont. But our grasslands are in a very, very important part of our food resiliency and agricultural economy, and I think will be increasingly more important to us as we are finding in these times of COVID. And the whole thing about a healthy farm organism and animals is that it's about animals on the land and at the being nimble enough to have the correct stocking rates to actually be improving your pastures as you maintain your livestock.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the holistic mindset that you're bringing into this discussion. I will add too, I know a great resource that a lot of Vermonters and people in this community talk about is the Savory Institute, S-A-V-O-R-Y, Alan Savory, and I'll post a link to that later. But there's a lot of evidence that having animals in contact with the land is really the only way to regenerate. So I think food choice is a different matter in my opinion.
And so what Alan Savory and other pioneers have shown too is that in more brittle environments where there's a protracted dry season, that and in areas of land that naturally wanted to be grasslands and then were degraded by agriculture or overgrazing or undergrazing, that a wise management of grazing animals, particularly ruminants, can be an incredibly effective tool for restoring degraded grasslands. And the carbon sequestration capacities of healthy grasslands are immense. You know, we had soils 10 feet deep or more in the center of this country prior to European occupation. And they were huge carbon sinks and teeming biospheres.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That was a great answer. And the only thing that I'll add is just the resource of Soil for Climate, which I'll put into the chat for people that are interested in learning more and being in discussions, although they can get a little heated sometimes. Soil for Climate is an incredible resource. They've got over 10,000 members on their Facebook page. It's a really global community, well researched, and also one of our sponsors of this series, because they're partly based out of Thetford, Vermont, and also Cambridge, Massachusetts. So highly recommend checking them out. They're great people. So Stephen, we have one more question for you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit away from the sort of technical farming stuff. Your presentation was so wonderful and really touched philosophically on some really broad, important issues that we're trying to also bring to light and into the discussion as a part of this series. So I thank you so much for your really thoughtful thinking, which I know to just be a part of who you are anyway. So I just really appreciate you bringing that here.
Thank you.
This last question is about just transition, which is an idea that you mentioned. What does that mean to you in the context of the Upper Valley? And what does the commons mean to you in your community and in the Upper Valley community?
Wow, those are great questions. So in addressing just transition, what I see is that if we as a region here in the Upper Valley embrace the concept that soil itself is the basic infrastructure of human civilization. So it's the basic infrastructure of terrestrial life, you know, going back 470 million years when algae and bacteria and fungi got together and created lichen and started colonizing the bare rock of Pangea and saying, oh, we don't need to wait for the nutrients to wash down to us. We're going to start up some life on the land. And now here we are, the walking, animate, self-questioning expressions of that original impetus to get onto the land from the ocean. And I think we're beginning to come to a collective ecological awareness that we need to create healthy soils in order to perpetuate not only life on Earth and our species, but in order to be worthy of the dignity of our human condition, become more ourselves. And so getting local about that. So what does it mean? So we've lost something like 30,000 agricultural acres in the Upper Valley since 1990. So how do we begin to value what we have left? And how do we find just transition for the conventional farms that occupy most of the agricultural land in our state, and in New Hampshire as well. People who are kind of locked into surviving year after year by holding on by their fingertips to their dairy farms need our help and assistance to move their farms towards more regenerative practices that will save our soils, save our resources, and save our farms. And so this is going to have to be a full-on societal program or a project that I see as being integral to what we're calling the Green New Deal, and here in Vermont, the Vermont Green New Deal, where all the incentives now are placed in the wrong directions, and all the money that is made out of agriculture is going to the producers of GMO seeds and pesticides. And so how do we turn that around and embrace these regenerative practices that put the profits on the basis of a healthy soil and rewarding for the capacity to produce food and create healthy soil and restore health and balance to the farm economy and the farm families. So the second part was
about the commons in.
Oh, the commons. So if we, the commons were basically undone by a capitalist system that commodifies virtually everything and externalizes environmental costs. In other words, doesn't account for them. And so that's the privatization of nature. And I think that we need a new understanding of land based on this understanding of the functions of the biological services, the ecological services of soil, and how they're intrinsic to our survival. And so we need to revalue. It's not that I'm saying people will not have rights to land and tenure of land, but we need to set a new criterion of responsibility for stewardship of land that ensures that land is regenerated rather than degenerated and degraded. And but when people are rewarded for regenerative practices, I think that the abundance and health and balance that are restored to a society through having that kind of relationship with land will be tenfold. But yeah.
Stephen, thank you so much. I'm really inspired, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with you and the rest of our community to make these ideas come to pass, because this is what we need. We know this is what we need, and thank you for being such a visionary.
Oh, thank you. It's a real honor to be here with you all.
Yes. So thank you, Kat and Stephen. Your cameras are going to get turned off, just so you know. And then I am going to introduce our next speaker today. Our next speaker is Sarah Cohen-Wood, who is a human security, conflict prevention, and resiliency planner. Ms. Wood has over 20 years of experience in conflict prevention, participatory public planning, and vulnerability and risk reduction strategies with a focus on resource conflicts like food, energy, water, and land, and recovery systems. Ms. Wood specializes in conflict resource analysis, adaptation strategies to climate crisis impacts, and the role that governance and social cohesion plays in the prevention and mitigation of conflict, radicalization, and instability. She's a former civil servant for the U.S. government and has worked for the USAID in the Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance Bureau. Ms. Wood served as the USAID liaison for the State Department's Office for the Coordinator of Reconstruction and Stabilization, which is now the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, not efforts, I apologize. She worked on the USG Fragile States Strategy and the Interagency Conflict Assessment Framework, and served as a conflict specialist for USAID's Office of Conflict Mitigation and Management, as well as a disaster risk reduction specialist and transition planner for the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. Ms. Wood has also done extensive research and implementation of alternative solution systems for community development and planning in countries around the world. These solution systems are community-led planning processes that focus on access and equity as essential components of recovery in complex crisis environments. Many of these approaches have focused on renewable and alternative energy systems, community-based conservation, local food production, land tenure systems, and carbon recovery and sequestration efforts as tools to strengthen complex systems in collapse, social, political, and economic collapse. She has worked in Indonesia, South Sudan, Northern Uganda, Cambodia, East Timor, Yemen, Iraq, Thailand, Myanmar, and several other fragile and recovering states. What we are going to do is we're going to put Sarah's camera on and let her say a quick hello. But then we're going to turn her video back off just because of the bandwidth that she's experiencing today. And so.
Hi, everybody. I apologize. Greetings. My internet connectivity tends to be a little wonky, and so sometimes if I have my camera on, it's very difficult to get good connectivity, but I'm really grateful to be here, and hopefully this presentation will be interesting. I just want to share some experiences from different places where they've been doing regeneration for just years and years and years, and just have a good community discussion about kind of the hopeful side of collapse a little bit. So hopefully it'll pick us up and not drag us down too much.
So thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so you can go ahead and turn your camera back off if you feel comfortable. Great. And then let me just click a couple buttons on my side.
Great. So welcome, everybody. The cheerful topic of this discussion is going to be about regeneration and collapse, but I actually am going to use that term regeneration a lot in this presentation. And, you know, Stephen gave a beautiful introduction to kind of the critical nature that soil plays, not just for soil health and for our ecology, but for everything. And some of the things that I want to share is that, you know, soil is the key to sequestering excess carbon. And not only that, it's actually the key to preventing conflict and political unrest. And I'm going to explain a little how it's not just about what's underneath our feet, but soil is really everything. Like, it is the basis of all life on the planet. And it's something that the hopeful part of it is that soil is incredibly resilient and adaptive. And, you know, it's made up of these mysterious components, but luckily, soil has a lot to teach us about adaptation and resilience, because in the midst of collapse, you can actually build soil health, and in thousands of different ways. And so I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of the lessons I've learned from around the world and then tie it back into the soil principles. Next slide. So, you know, climate change, basically what it means is ecosystems in transition. And, you know, the reality is I don't think there's anybody who will deny that climate change is happening around the world. But what it also means is that there's not always an inherent good or an inherent bad. What happens with climate change is things transition. And in order to be resilient and adaptive, one of the things we need to do is understand that transition actually is an opportunity for regeneration. And that even though our ecological systems are under great stress, there are ways to kind of remediate and mitigate and hold some of that stress. And you can do that through regenerative practices. So the next slide, please. So, you know, some of our biodiversity stresses, I think a lot of us know what they are, but there is just huge amounts of seasonal and yearly variation. I mean, Stephen's seen it on the farm here. There's temperature changes, there's precipitation changes, there's extreme weather phenology that's just happening all over the planet. I think a lot of us have read about the incredible rates of extinction that have happened, not just with plants and animals, but with insects, kind of worldwide. And then in the south, you know, in the Northeast, we've got cold water fisheries, we've got moose, we've got eastern hemlock, we've got insect taxa, and there's just a lot of like reproductive and like survival stress that we witness within our biodiversity. And that's not just in North America and the Upper Valley, but it's just all over the world. And, you know, we are starting to notice these things with kind of our information sharing and social media and scientific articles and things like that. I think we're a lot more aware of it. But quite frankly, this has been happening for thousands and hundreds of years to just indigenous cultures all over. And so, part of this is really understanding that regeneration and collapse is kind of a global and shared form of suffering. And it's almost like we have a responsibility when we talk about things like just transition to understand that everything we do matters, and that starting with the soil is an incredibly empowering place to be, because it really, everything you do with soil health will help other systems that rely on that soil for survival. Next slide. So these are just pre-COVID, because I think the world has been changing very rapidly, is that, without rapid decarbonization in the next 10 years or 12 years at the most, the projected climate refugees by 2050 is 200 million plus. The price increase for staple crops by that same date, just as a result of climate change, is going to be wheat, 67%, rice, 80%. This is just a very short list. And just in China, which is a country that has a huge amount of people, water scarcity by 2100 is going to affect over 1 billion people, and that's just in one country. And the global economic effect of that, they say, is going to be about 600 trillion, but quite frankly, it's going to be a lot higher than that. And some of the costs you can't even calculate when you look at what it does to communities or people who are having to move around the world. Next slide. So here's an example. So this is a country where this little girl, her plant, the place where she stands, her local environment is sinking as a result of climate change. And you can see these palm trees in the background. This is a coastal area. And it's just, literally what happens is that sea rise and climate change is literally going to make people move around the world. So it's something where we have to pay attention to the fact that as bad as we think things are, they're always worse for somebody else. And so everything we do matters at a scale that sometimes we can't even comprehend. Next slide. So if we think about COVID-19, there's a lot of parallels and similarities to this virus. They're both public health emergencies, because climate collapse and climate change is impacting the mental, social, and physical health of people all over the planet. They're both ecological emergencies. There's a lot of parallels that have shown that the spread of viruses and kind of these superbugs that we're experiencing over time, and likely to experience a lot more over time, are really caused by systems collapse. They're caused by the lack of wildlife health and the lack of rangeland management for a lot of species of animals that are under stress. And so when they interact with humans, previously they might not have transitioned or transferred disease, but now they do, because they themselves are facing disease systems. They're both going to cause a lot of economic collapse around the United States and around the world. And quite frankly, both of them are human-induced. Climate collapse, climate change, COVID, there's human responsibilities that we have for both of these calamities that we face. And they're both products of disease systems. We've got habitat loss, we've got lack of biodiversity, we've got soil depletion. The list just goes on. And so, I think COVID, in a strange way, it's like viruses aren't inherently bad. We need viruses to kind of change our ecologies as we go through time, and they're important for our evolutionary systems. But there's also things about them that can teach us things about how we respond to these systems collapses and these stresses that we feel in our environments. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about regenerative ecology. And, Stephen mentioned regenerative ag, which is part of regenerative ecology. And, what this is essentially is it's looking at ecology from a different lens. It's saying that in order to be resilient, we have to acknowledge the fragilities that we are experiencing, and we have to become what is called anti-fragile. And what that really means is not just saying you're becoming resilient, but adapting to changes as they come. And as you adapt, rather than exploiting the environment, what you try to do is you try to regenerate things. And so rather than causing things to deplete, you're really using a completely different framework when you design any intervention. And so overseas, we do it all the time because I work in these, these countries that are under huge amounts of stress. And so they may have had, lack of access to food for decades because of conflict. And so you're building like a food chain system, or you're looking at lack of access to water for a significant amount of time. And so what it does is, it rather than looking at things as being exploitive, you're always looking at solutions that are regenerating. So they're adding complexity to a system, not trying to simplify it by taking things away. Next slide. So, this is just a kind of an example of what it is. And it's really a state of mind. And I always try to explain it when you're trying to design like anything from a planning system to like a food security system. A good way of thinking about it is that in a regenerating system, you are counterbalancing an exploitive approach. So basically, what you're always trying to do is you're trying to decrease energy use. And a lot of times, the way I work with it is because a lot of times in some of the countries that I work with, they literally can't move things around because they don't have these systems that we have in terms of, they don't have a huge amount of oil production sometimes. They also might have limited ability to kind of move things around. And so they need to have systems in place that usually are alternative, that are almost always regenerative, and are looking at ways of counterbalancing things that are very carbon heavy. And so the great thing about regenerative ecology is when you apply it to any system, it has the same exact principles, which is that basically you're looking for participation in the design, because the participation is critical, because you're not working against nature, you're using humans to be integrated into the natural system. And so by trying to improve like soil health, for example, or food security, you're looking at ways that humans become an integral part of that system. And so you're always trying to reconcile things that are preventing humans from working with nature in a way that gives them the food that they need, or the farming or land that they need in a way that's going to be regenerative. And it's restorative. I mean, you're looking at systems where often you're trying to build up farmland that maybe has been in disuse for decades because of war, or here, because farming has changed so much and you've had these big kind of like agro-biz systems. What's happened is that at every scale, you have to look at regeneration, and you have to look at what are you doing to increase or to decrease the energy use, and basically promote a way of doing agriculture that uses less carbon. Next slide. So the principles follow a lot of what people might be familiar with permaculture a little bit, but it's slightly different. It's looking at systems and principles where you're always trying to be redundant, meaning that, people ask about biodiversity, and what it essentially means is making sure you have redundancies, because if something becomes diseased or if something doesn't work, you always want to have something else that is similar to see whether that might work. And so redundancy is incredibly important in regenerative ag and regenerative practices. And the reason for that is you're always experimenting to see what works best with the integrated systems that you're working with. The other principle that's really important is this idea of multifunctionality. And what that means essentially is that, you want things that serve many functions. If you're doing a water system, you want people to be able to drink it, but you also want to be able to use it for irrigation and crops. If you're doing a road, you might want the road to be built in such a way that it increases movements for goods so that people can get from markets, but you also want the road to provide berm protection if you have floods or extreme weather events. So you're building the road in such a way that you're creating like berms, or you're creating wildlife corridors, or you're creating some type of management system that is using the road as a way of creating health and movement. And so it's a big part of these systems. The other thing is interconnection. A lot of times when you're looking at regenerative ag or regenerative practices such as permaculture, one of the things that you're looking at the fact that human systems interact with natural systems, but it doesn't stop there. There's social systems, there's political systems, and so you're always looking at a design system that tries to react and tries to kind of interact with those connections. And even if those connections seem to be in conflict with one another, you're trying to figure out and keep challenging those systems to integrate with one another. Because the idea behind regeneration is, rather than exploit people or exploit systems, you're trying to learn how these systems can actually be regenerative. And one of the keys to that, and I think especially in the Upper Valley, in the Northeast, and in the North American context, you know, things have to be locally adapted. You know, you can do these at any scale, but every system has to have local knowledge. Like, you have to adapt it to where you are. You know, whether if you've stolen land from somebody, or if you have like a very denuded landscape, or you have a complex like social conflict, you have to work with those local contexts because whatever system you design, it's not going to be regenerative unless it's adapted to those local problems and conditions. But the interesting thing is that a lot of this knowledge is in our bodies. I mean, it's literally in our memories. I mean, there's incredible amounts of wisdom that is actually all around us. Like, most of the systems that we have in the Upper Valley, quite frankly, are global systems that have been adapted for the North American context. I mean, I can drive around Vermont farms and I can look at probably 20 systems, and I can tell you where they've come from in different parts of the world, because we actually have adapted a lot of this global knowledge to our local context, especially in Vermont. There's a lot of examples of this, and it's fascinating. So those are just some principles that we can think about. Next slide. So soil is life. Stephen said this beautifully. It is, I couldn't write that font big enough. The soil food web is just, it's critical for the planet. It's critical for our survival. And it's really, really important that we think about soil from all perspectives, and not just under our feet, but we think about where we get our food and how we're treating the systems that we're a part of, and how they literally, every single one of them is dependent on soil. Next slide. So this is an interesting slide. You've probably seen it a million times. What is soil? Essentially, it's air, water, mineral matter, and a very tiny bit of organic matter. Like, actually, soil itself is a very small amount of organic matter, but that organic matter is everything. Without it, you can't have, you know, you really can't have good quality life. And soil that's been bioengineered, there's ways of remediating soil, and it's a very important practice in regenerative ag, is that a lot of what we're doing, actually, when we look at soil, Stephen mentioned that in North America, you know, hundreds of years ago, there used to be, you know, feet upon feet of topsoil here. I mean, and not topsoil, really, really good soil. And now it's like you're working with these very denuded landscapes. And so, you know, part of it is understanding that, you know, good soil health and good regenerative practices rest in this idea of always experiment with improving soil health. And we go back to the soil principles, but we can also use different practices from around the world that within, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years, it's amazing the changes you can make to an incredibly denuded landscape. Next slide. So this is a slide that just shows some of the different types of soil that we have and that we kind of struggle with. But I will challenge to say that, honestly, around the world, I've seen things grow in soil that I can't believe things grow in. So the beauty of soil is it is one of the most regenerative structures I've ever witnessed in my life, is that the way you can build soil is just phenomenal over time. Next slide. So this is probably a slide that may be familiar to some of you, and basically what it shows is it's showing you the idea that the more healthy your soil is, the easier it is to grow different types of vegetation. And so basically it's just saying that, you know, there's certain kind of succession patterns with growth that basically just strengthen the soil. So the more you can put in the soil, the better your soil will be over time. And so the more you can leave in the soil, you know, transitioning to perennials instead of annuals, transitioning to kind of trees over time, or mixing grasses with trees, and doing different types of kind of growing, whether you're market gardening or doing silvopasture, or you're doing agroforestry or forest gardens. There's just a lot of different practices you can do and introductions you can make that actually will build soil health up pretty quickly. Next slide. So, you know, what's great is that, you know, we live on a planet that has a very beautiful topography. And a lot of us live in places where we can work with the landscape. So rather than, you know, making very complex like irrigation systems or relying on super complex water filtration systems, in soil health, you actually can use some pretty basic things to slow and sink water in a way that allows you to grow lots of things on a landscape that you wouldn't think could actually bear life in that way. Next slide. So this is kind of an aerial view of a part of China, and what's really interesting about this is you can see the areas where water flows, because it always will flow down from ridges into valleys, and so you can see where the valleys are, there's a lot more water retention, and so they've got a lot more green plants. But even on a small landscape, like this is a pretty big area, but even on a small landscape on your own property, you can do this. And some people do it by, you know, farming in areas where it's already naturally present, or if they can't, they may actually build systems on their farms or on their food landscapes to actually slow or sink water so that they can use it for natural irrigation. Next slide. This is just another example in Nepal where it's kind of interesting, because what they do there is they'll build, you know, these little villages up high, you know, and then they'll use the terrace landscapes for growing rice and things like that. And then they've basically been able to support a pretty big number of people with very concentrated areas of food production. And it just protects the rest of the landscape, which is really great. Next slide. And this just shows you, you know, if you capture water when it runs downhill, this is a natural catchment basin that actually was man-made. But you can do this on a small scale, you can do it on a wide scale, and it's literally been done around the world for all kinds of crop management. Next slide. So I want to honor the fact that, you know, these practices are really old, but they're really old practices that actually have been adapted and used over time. So they've been incredible gifts to us down the centuries and down the years. And, you know, a good thing to ask ourselves always, I like to say, like, one of my favorite questions is, are we being good ancestors? And one way of thinking about that is, are the practices that I'm doing now regenerative for the earth that I now live on? And so chinampas is a good example. They were invented by the Aztec civilization, ancient civilization. And basically what happened is they were experiencing a lot of climate change. And so they were having these huge floods. And so what they did is they would take these flooded landscapes and they would create these floating gardens. And they did it through creating these artificial islands that were basically built by interweaving reeds with stakes beneath the lake surface. And they would create these kind of underwater fences, and then they would build soil content on top of those little islands to grow food on. And it was incredible practice that they developed kind of in response to fluctuating drought and rainy periods. And it was incredibly successful for them. And it's actually practiced in multiple countries around the world. Indonesia does it, Nepal does it. So the practice itself, whether it's from trade or whether it's from the travel of information or whether it's ancestral in our DNA, these practices do survive over time. Next slide. So this is an interesting slide, because if you think about it, there's a continuum that exists between nature and the way we practice agriculture as humans living currently in the 21st century. And the beauty of nature is that there are things within nature that make it adaptive and naturally resilient. And the things that make it adaptive and naturally resilient are the same things that actually put it at risk. And I'm going to explain that a little bit. So in nature, you know, it has really low fragility, meaning that, I mean, things just want to grow. I mean, even in soil that is incredibly denuded, things really, really want to grow. Whereas in agriculture, if there's an extreme weather event or people lose their cropland, especially in kind of this monomass agriculture we have in North America, it's really, really vulnerable to fragility, because I was in South Sudan a few years ago when they were having the beginning of those big floods they're having now. And it was fascinating because, you know, what happened is that, you know, people lost just huge amounts of their arable land where they had done heavy ag. But in areas where they had done like other kinds of agriculture, meaning more regenerative practices, the flooding was, the impact of it was very minimal. And those are areas where I would say they were doing like some civil pasture, they were doing like much more biodiverse kind of concentrated gardening practices. And so there's things that we do within the agricultural systems that are very different than what we do in nature. And so the closer you can get to mimicking the way nature provides food and energy and resources, the more likely we are to be regenerative. And so this continuum is kind of interesting because what it does is it allows us to think differently, because what we want to do is we want to be anti-fragile. And what that means is we want to create agricultural systems that regenerate our landscape and that use less energy and actually use a different kind of land and animal management, so that we're looking at more rotational practices and things that carbon sequester and don't actually draw carbon out from the soil. Next slide. So these are just some examples. I mean, there are some amazing examples. This is in China, and this is an area where they had an old road and it had just been, you know, just travel on forever, and they're just areas of heavy drought and just like way overused. And it basically just, what they did is they did concentrated planning to regenerate this old road system that kind of spanned these two villages. And the idea was to create more arable land for people that lived very rurally and no longer use these old road systems, but also turn the old road systems into places where people could grow food. So this is a project in China. Next slide. It can also be personal. This is the Jordan Valley, and this is just, you know, somebody's yard, you know, and I mean, basically, I mean, you can see that soil. I mean, that soil is just incredibly denuded, but over time, what you can do is the more you introduce to the landscape, and you can see like this gentleman, you know, I mean, it's really like the more biodiversity you have, the more experimentation, the more redundancy, the more you're just not afraid of plant failure. Just put things into the ground, the more likely you are to have regeneration and in a short amount of time. Next slide. And then also, I use the term remediation mindfully, is that regeneration and remediation are very close allies. And in India, what they've done is in places where there's been a lot of pollution and a lot of urban stress, they've been starting to turn these like incredibly polluted areas into sinks. And what I mean by that is that they're calling them green sinks, and places basically where people can reclaim those areas and bioremediate by using those areas that have been incredibly polluted to make them healthy again, for things like this is a little aquaculture pond that actually has fish in it. And the fish themselves are providing remediation for a very terrible environment that used to be there. But it's healthy for the fish. It doesn't hurt them. The plants along the side also help with the remediation of the water content. And then the water eventually will act as a filtration system for the water from that urban center. Next slide. And then it just breeds life. This is an area in Indonesia that had Central Sulawesi that had conflict for just decades. And you know, when they didn't have as much conflict, people wanted to go back into these areas and grow food, and they did. And so what you saw over about an 11-year, I guess it was 13-year period, is you saw these areas that were incredibly denuded turning into living landscapes again. And the reason for that is people moved back into these areas and they started experimenting and they started growing things again. And it really provided new life to those areas that had been really denuded over time. Next slide. So it's definitely, regenerative agriculture is a state of mind. You know, in North America especially, you know, and farming, you know, people have a way of farming, and, you know, it's often the way that they've learned how to farm from maybe a family member or something they've read, and sometimes maybe they haven't read enough or they haven't experienced different practices. And so, you know, it's really a state of mind to know, when does this practice of agriculture become exploitive? And when is it in balance with the land? And when is it adding things to the living biology that we're so reliant on? Next slide. So the big thing is that agriculture, like Stephen said, it is important. I mean, we can't live without food. And it's an incredibly just integral part of the human experience, is being a part of a living landscape. And there are lots and lots of soil solutions that mitigate human damage. And they can be done at a big scale, they can be done at a small scale, they can be done literally on any scale you can imagine, they can be done. Next slide. And what you want to do is you want to think about it always from this slide a little bit, which is that it's not enough to be resilient. Like, that puts you kind of in balance. But what you really want to do is you want to be anti-fragile. And the way to do that is to really keep thinking regeneratively all the time. And whenever you face a challenge and you're looking for a response system or a solution, the thing you want to think about is it promoting fragility or is it promoting anti-fragility? And if you're going towards the anti-fragility framework, my guess is you're going towards regeneration. And if you're worried about something that's going to be really fragile, you're being exploitive. And I can say that about almost any system of planning I've been a part of. Next slide. So, you know, in Vermont and around the world, we've got a lot of heat and drought. And actually, that's going to be a big problem. I mean, ironically, you know, yes, we're going to have increased rain, but that increased rain is actually going to cause increased drought in Vermont as well. Next slide. So these are just some figures to kind of consider, is the range and increases of average temperature, and then increases in heat waves. And you know, the problem with this heat and drought, of course, is that it's really hard on human health. It's incredibly hard on soil health, because soil suffers when there's huge fluctuations in temperature, and when soils get too hot, they do tend to lose organic matter. It's like, you do want to heat your soils, like there's some kind of counteractive thoughts to that, but the reality is very, very high temperatures are incredibly difficult for soil structure. Next slide. So a lot of what we'll do in Vermont, my guess is that over time we'll do a lot more tree-based agriculture. It's really important to experiment with this and show people how incredibly valuable this can be, because just planting, you know, 20 or 50 trees can make a huge difference in soils and carbon sequestration, and it's pretty easy to do. There's certain animals that tend to work better with silvopasture, but quite frankly, I've seen it done all over the world with probably every kind of animal imaginable. So my theory is I think it works with almost everything. And you can really do a lot of different types of trees and plantings. And so tree-based agriculture is incredibly important. And so the slide on the left shows you a lot of the principles of regeneration, because you can see there's lots of redundant crops. There's different kinds of crops that are different for different multi-functionalities, and you can see a lot of interconnections of the use of the land. So you can see like a grape arbor, you can see a nuthatch grove, you can see a lot of different crops that are being grown, and so people are thinking differently about their production systems and how, and you won't see any bare soil in that landscape. Next slide. So the big principle with tree-based agriculture is tree cover is good. I mean, it for health outcomes, for mitigating and remediating particulate pollution, fewer premature tree deaths. I mean, just the more tree cover we can integrate into every kind of landscape, the better. And this is urban and rural. It also is incredibly important for soil temperature and soil health. I mean, things are just naturally cooler in the shade, but it also helps with transpiration. And so that increases really rapidly when soil is above 70 degrees. And so you really want to, you know, discourage that from happening. And then tree cover improves animal health and reproduction. I mean, animals do better in those kinds of climates. Next slide. So this is about landscape water management. Next slide. So, you know, basically this is just about thinking differently about how we manage water, because one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in Vermont and the Upper Valley is this is a lot of water happening in these weather events and kind of just pummeling farms. And so I think that a lot of places over in countries where I've worked, they've done really innovative practices to manage like really heavy rain events. And we're going to have to think about that with everything, with road building, with farms, and there's just a lot of really ancient practices that are incredibly cheap and are not carbon heavy that should be used more, especially in our Upper Valley and kind of Vermont landscapes. There's just a lot of ways of increasing soil organic matter improvements with landscape water management, and some of it is just, you know, using earthworks instead of a lot of carbon heavy systems, and then integrating, you know, integration with grazing and tree crop patterns just basically minimize the amount of water you have to use, and then using different kinds of like earthen dams and infiltration basins that are more organic in nature and rather than big fossil fuel intensive irrigation systems. Next slide. So this shows you Vermont in Irene, and gosh, I mean, just a tremendous amount of damage in a very, very short amount of time. Next slide. So, you know, this is going to be a fact of life in Vermont, is going to be a lot of floods. And, you know, I think, you know, we're just going to have a lot of precipitation. And so to think very clearly about regeneration rather than just mitigation is really helpful when you think about the trends that are likely to happen over time. And so some of it is like, you know, when these major storm events are going to happen, they are going to happen because they've happened with increasing frequency in Vermont, and then just a lot more in the northern Atlantic, is that, you know, there are ways of thinking about how to deal with floods well in advance. And a lot of it has to do with regenerative practices. Next slide. So in Vermont, a really good solution for some of the anticipated floods and weather events is to think about things that are, once again, regenerative, so multifunctional, you know, and that provide kind of bigger and more services. And a lot of this is like looking at riparian buffers and kind of wetland preserves, like places where you can kind of sink in slow water, and having those, you know, as more and more as practices within the agricultural system in Vermont that are either, I don't want to say they have to be mandatory, but should become kind of common parlay when it comes to land use management and planning. And then the other thing is that agriculture itself can be a productive buffer if you do regenerative ag. And so, you know, you can actually increase land and food production by doing these types of mitigation practices. Next slide. And it kind of falls in, it's interesting, like a lot of this falls into more food, because a lot of the regenerative practices that you do to kind of adapt and remediate, you know, anticipated climate change impacts is by maximizing biodiversity and using different kinds of land-race varieties. What happens is you're actually building soil health, you're creating food security, because you're creating, you know, crops and food plants, pollinator structures and things that are much more ecologically sound and not as fragile as some of the GMO varieties that we use. And it basically just provides better human health. Next slide. And a big part of this, this is pretty prevalent in permaculture, is forest gardens. And the reason for this is that, you know, forest gardens are polycultures of multi-purpose plants. And so they produce a huge amount of products in very small spaces. And so they don't leave a lot of bare soil. They use something that's called gilding, which is basically looking for varieties of plants that grow well together. And the reason they grow well together is because their mycology and the way that they interact with fungi and kind of the subterrane of soil is collaborative. And so those guilds of plants that we use in forest gardens have a relationship. They have a symbiotic relationship that is just beautiful, because when they grow well together, they're going to provide a great abundance of food and products for you and your families, but also they're going to build soil health over time. That's going to be like, even if you test a small area that does an edible forest garden over a 3-year period, you're going to see a huge change in soil health, much more so than you'd see with conventional gardening. Next slide. And so, regenerative too, the ecosystem functions are really important. So you're always thinking about this kind of multifunctionality and this interconnection. And so you're looking for things that are nitrogen fixation, things that accumulate a lot of different varieties and purposes. You're looking for plants that provide nectar, and you're looking for things that kind of can be pest confusers as well. So you're looking at, rather than killing insects with like pesticides and things like that, you're just looking at a way of using plant matter and plant relationships to confuse the insects you don't want and to encourage the insects you do. So rather than exploiting nature by trying to kill all of the insects with these pesticides that are just so harmful to so many of the good insects we need, you just confuse the ones that you don't want in your crops. And then you don't have to kill them, because they often serve other purposes in other landscapes. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about the wetlands and riparian zones, but a big part of the regenerative land practices is thinking about creating banks so that when you have water, that it's not eroding the soil along those water edges, which is a big problem with farming and agricultural practices. You're providing buffers, and what that means essentially is like pathways that exist between two functions of land or land management that provide a space or an edge that tends to have a lot of biodiversity and encourages insect and plant life that's more natural rather than using pesticides. And then corridors, both for human movement and wildlife movement, but also for insect movement, because you really need corridors of certain colors and types of plants so that insects have like landing, I like to call them landing runways. So you have to think intuitively about what you're planting and what they need, because those things are incredibly important for regeneration. Next slide. So you've got to think about everything when you're thinking about regeneration. You're thinking not just about the soil, but you're thinking about the entire planet. You're thinking about pollinators, and you're thinking about all of the things that they need in terms of color spectra and nectaries and different kinds of plant species, and things that basically encourage habitat features that are critical for pollination, because bees pollinate 2/3 of our fruit and food, and they also are responsible for 85% of pollination. And so without bees and certain pollinators, human life cannot exist. So these things are not just nice things to do to protect pollinators, they are practices that are incredibly important for all life on the planet. And so, agroforestry, combining agriculture and tree-based management and care, is incredibly important, because what it does is it lets us expand farming into forests without taking those forests and clear cutting them for farming, because the idea is there's an interconnection that exists between food production and trees. And for many, many centuries, and actually in most parts of the world, they don't just clear cut for agriculture. They actually do an connected system between trees and food. And what's hurt us is these big agrobiz systems that have basically took out the forest, but we need to bring that connection back into regenerative land management. And then the riparian buffers and kind of on-farm wetlands, those are important not just for habitat reserves, but they're really important for flood and drought resilience. And so, you know, thinking about how we can help farmers think more about kind of habitat management is really critical. Next slide. And so this is just a picture of what happens when you leave plants in the ground. Like the more plants, the better the roots. And it's just really important. I just can't say it enough. Like regeneration is just plant, plant, plant. Like put as much as you can into the soil as you possibly can. Next slide. And so hopefully now these principles will make a little bit more sense and, you know, kind of get into your heart and your head in a more interconnected way. Next slide. Because really it's like regenerative ecology is a good solution system for kind of the mess that we're in. And what it really means is living locally but learning globally, because you know, anything we do has probably been done before and probably done in a place where they've been doing it for a really long time. So, you know, don't be afraid to like learn lessons from other places and just humbly take it as a gift. Because the only way to be good ancestors is to live thinking regeneratively instead of exploitively. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I think you really did a great job of framing the global aspect of all of this work and contextualizing it really well. I'm really grateful for all of those great photos that you have. I wish I was as well-traveled as you are. I'm going to ask a couple questions. We don't have a ton of time for questions because we do want to get to a quick little go around. But Kat and I will both ask you maybe one or two questions if that works for you.
Absolutely.
And so the question I'm going to ask is from the chat, and the question is, how can farms who are reliant on annual seed markets begin to transition toward landrace production and seed saving? And it's okay, you don't have the perfect answer, but just what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I love seed saving. You know, a lot of that is looking at seed saving practices. So a good way to do it in your farming practice is to create seed swaps and seed sharing with farmers in your immediate area who have found plants that tend to be resilient to the conditions in which we are. So for example, at Cobb Hill where I live, I've started a project of collecting as many seeds from as many trees and plants as I possibly can, because a lot of ways of creating these landrace varieties is looking at plants that grow in the conditions where you are. And it's really cheap. I mean, learning to seed save can take just an hour of your time. And there's certain seasons where it's just incredibly productive. It's free. And there's a lot of people who can either show you how to do it or can trade with you to get those varieties really quickly. And there's some really good companies that sell them, but it's always good to keep it as local as you can, because that actually builds a lot of health for biodiversity and different types of ecological management. And so the more you can seed save from your region, the better it is actually for the planet.
Awesome, thank you. Kat, you have the next one?
I do, and I just put some links into the chat for folks to learn about Upper Valley Seed Savers and Solstice Seeds, which are both Upper Valley organizations. We're very lucky to have a lot of people in the Upper Valley working on saving seeds for us. And Solstice Seeds in Heartland is a place where you can buy those seeds and help that keep going. Yeah, Sarah, I would love to ask you about the Green New Deal. So Stephen mentioned in the chat that the Green New Deal in Vermont might be a way of moving forward. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts on Vermont's Green New Deal?
You know, I have mixed feelings about it. I think it's a good step in the direction of looking differently at the collapse of our agricultural systems and how difficult it is for our systems probably to survive much into the next 100 years. So I think by having some of those mitigation measures, it's allowed us to look at the kind of inevitable economic failures of big agriculture. And so, however, I think the Green New Deal has to do a lot more with regeneration. and regenerative ag, because currently, you know, if you have to provide a alternative system to the inevitable collapse of the dairy industry and other industries that we've become reliant on. And I don't think the Green New Deal goes far enough in saying, you know, what are the alternatives, you know, and how are we going to promote those through policies and practices, you know, both at the national deal, you know, the national level, but also just within our ecosystem here in Vermont.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Do 2 more questions. So I'm going to ask a question about the images that you were showing that were incredibly motivating, and they clearly told a story of like before and after of peace and restoration and abundance for a region. And I think oftentimes we in America or Vermont, whatever you want to call our we, often think about conflict and degradation going on in other parts of the world, and we forget about the historical context in our own community. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a bit about addressing how thinking about the environment really requires addressing human conflict, even in a place like the US.
I think that's a fabulous question. And, you know, we live on landscapes that have been exploited. You know, we have stolen land from people who had incredibly regenerative practices. You know, we've killed, you know, cultures that really had a relationship of interconnection with the land that really has I think, damaged our own souls a little bit. However, you know, saying that, I mean, I think if you look at Vermont, I mean, so much of Vermont was sheep pastures. Like where I live at Cobb Hill is a good example. I mean, they cut down a ton of trees so that they could have sheep. And then they denuded this landscape with all of these sheep. Not that sheep are bad, but it's just the way that it was practiced was really hard. And, you know, all of that came from a huge conflict that has happened for just, you know, we continue to have conflict, even if we feel like we live in a place that has land that we may or may not own. And so I think that, you know, I always think that conflict is systemic and ancestral. Like we have to think about the fact that everything we do is going to cause tension. And so the more we can regenerate these practices and the more we can kind of build these practices back into our cosmology, I think the more important it is, because I think it kind of honors the people that we've exploited, and I think it kind of retilts the scales and kind of recalibrates our own systems a little bit. So in some ways I see regenerative ecology as a way of kind of making a little bit of peace with the fact that we have come from a very exploitive place, no matter where we are, kind of in our local ecology.
Thank you, Sarah. So related to that, I have a question. You know, we hear a lot about appropriation of ideas and cultures and how that's not a good thing. And I just wonder, I'm thinking that there might be other people on the call who wonder about the difference between adaptation of ideas and technologies from other cultures and appropriation of ideas and technologies from other cultures. And I just wonder, what are your thoughts on those particular words, and how do we modify our behaviors to make sure that we're adapting with love and resilience and respect?
You know, I've been involved in international permaculture for probably, I don't know, 20, 30 years or something. And I've felt that way a lot, you know, because I think acculturation is real. But I also think that it's also a state of mind where you can get to a place where you feel so guilty that you don't act in a way that makes you a good ancestor. And I really mean that seriously, which is that, you know, these are practices that have found their way into our consciousness. Like there are water systems and swale systems here that people are doing in Vermont that come from Chiapas, you know, and come from Peru. And so, you know, I think what we need to do is, rather than, you know, worry all the time about acculturation, we need to honor our ancestors and honor what we're doing, as these are practices that build the ecology of Earth. And I think it's a healing practice. because I think that feeling is real. I mean, I feel it myself, but I think it can be a healing practice to actually regenerate soil on the land.
Thank you.
That was a great answer.
That was a great answer. Thank you, Sarah and Kat. So we have about 12 minutes left. And so I am going to turn everyone's camera back on, but I'm going to leave you muted. And we're going to do a quick go around, and I'm going to unmute people in order, and I'll tell you who's being unmuted and when. We'll do a quick go around. I will go through quickly and turn everybody's camera on. So give me 1 second to do that.
And if you put yourself in gallery view, you'll be able to see everybody.
And then, Kat, do you want to start the go around?
Sure. So what we like to do in these go arounds is to ask, what is one thing from both Stephen and Sarah's presentations, one or maybe two things, keeping in mind that we have really just 10 minutes left, that resonates with you, or one question that you have that we might not have time to answer. And the reason we do this is because we need to all get to know each other and continue these conversations beyond this particular call, and ask ourselves these questions, and ask our neighbors and our family these questions. So I'll start, and I'll just say, I am so impressed and so grateful to have both Sarah and Stephen in the Upper Valley with us. Aren't we blessed? They're both amazing people providing such great services and ideas and love to our community, and I'm just so grateful. The thing that really comes to me and sticks with me is, how do we actualize the dismantling of damaging belief systems and change our behavior every day individually, so that we are working toward the belief systems that we know to be true.
Thanks, Kat. I just want to do a quick shout. I think I asked everybody to turn their video on, but if you did not get that request from me, please type into the chat. And then the couple of people who are on the phone, we will also get to you. So please stay on the phone. So I'm going to go first I'm going to go first to Marilyn. And I'm going to unmute you. And very soon, I'm going to unmute you. There we go. If you would like to share, please share.
It was wonderful. I really appreciate, especially getting a chance to hear the global look at it. And soil is life. Water is life too, but soil is the melding of all of that and requires the water too. So I so appreciate listening in. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Stephen. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Marilyn. And now I'm going to, you muted yourself. Perfect. Thank you so much. Caitlin Waddick. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, Caitlin Waddick. I love all the regenerative ecology principles, especially hearing it applied to soils. And I'm very excited about the promise of agroforestry, and yet stymied how to do it in my suburban yard. Check.
Thank you. Next I have Catherine. Hi, Catherine.
Hi. I came in late, but I was here in time for Sarah Wood's presentation, which was excellent. And I really appreciated all the information and the beautiful photographs in different parts of the world where regenerative agriculture is being practiced. So thank you.
Thank you. And then Connie. Hi, Connie.
Hello. Hi. I really appreciate everyone's talks. It was great. I typed in a question earlier that I think or a comment that may have been mistaken a little, about trying to do this nationally or worldwide without getting humans to consume fewer animal products. And I think it may be a mistaken is that I think the whole world should be vegan and never have any animals anywhere. And I'm wondering, I guess, what Sarah thinks, if she's seen places around the world. Do you think that we do need to reduce consumption, and how can we, if maybe I'm wrong and we don't, how can we talk about that or get the understanding so that we can have these really resilient, regenerative communities?
Awesome. I am going to actually go to Sarah now, and so she will just answer that question, and it'll be her turn if that works.
Thanks.
Sarah. There you go, Sarah. Oops, I hit unmute the same time you did.
You know, actually, I'm a vegan. I'll just own it. However, I think that there are lots of ways that animals, you know, there used to be practices where people ate animals and integrated animals into their diet, but also had different ways of treating animals. And I think that, you know, I actually don't have any judgments about people eating animals, because I've lived in places where they wouldn't survive if they didn't eat an animal. But I think also, you know, our care for animals is a direct, if we look at the soil, the better the soil is, the more we're caring for the animals. And I can say in every country I've been in, every time the animals have degraded the soil, the animals are poorly treated. And so that's why I think silvopasture and agroforestry and things like that can help that problem, because you can't have as many animals if you do these practices. And so people are going to have to balance their diets differently, and they're going to have to be less exploitive of their pattern of eating and food consumption. So that's a good question.
Awesome. And Sarah, do you want to add anything else for your reflection back to?
Yeah, I'm so thankful to Lauren and Kat, because they've done an amazing job on this series, and just deep namaste, deep bow. And Stephen, I just love Stephen's passion, and I'm so lucky to live with him and watch him talk to his horses every day as he does his fields. So very thankful, and thankful to you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Grace, coming to you. Hey, Grace.
Hi, well, I'm really glad I managed to be present for this wonderful, both of you, Stephen and Sarah. I've been admiring you from a distance, and I am very impressed with not only your level of knowledge, but your clarity of presentation, and that's a high compliment. Thank you. Yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add. I think you did a great job of putting the pieces together, and I am looking forward to more interaction in years to come. Thank you.
Hello?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
My name is Hi, I came in late, so I didn't hear the whole presentation, but what I heard was really great. Are you asking questions?
So now it's kind of just this reflection time. If you wanted to share any thoughts or ask a question that might not get answered, now's the time for that. You can also say your name if you want to.
Say it again. Say my name.
If you want to, if you feel comfortable.
Oh, my name's Olga Kuchikov. No, I'm good. My questions would be way too complicated and specific and take up too much time. So.
Hi, Olga.
Hi. Is that Kat?
That is Kat, yes.
Hi.
All right, thank you so much, Olga.
Thank you.
I am going to Lynn now. Maybe. There we go.
There. Just delighted to hear a coming together of many things that I've been struggling to find information on, and very excited to think of food forests, forest agriculture, and would love to resource Sarah more about the guilds around different trees that could be part of the understory and the ground cover that will support the health of the trees, the soil, and also really nourishing food. So thank you for that. And soil is life. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Lynn. Everything keeps jumping. Kat, coming to you. Hey, Kat.
Yeah, hi. I enjoyed the presentation so much today, and there's always something to learn from the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. So very grateful to Lauren and Kat for introducing these wonderful speakers and all the information that they have to share. And I'm always inspired. Today, I also was inspired by the idea of forest farming and, you know, yields that can come. And I also appreciated being reminded that animals are part of the soil. So when Stephen mentioned that, even if you just bring in some sort of fertility that is animal-based, I was glad to be reminded of that. So yeah, it was very informative, and the time just flew by. I was just wrapped in attention. So thank you for everything.
Thanks, Cap. Dee Dee, I'm coming to you next.
I think I'm done.
Yeah, I had to join. I mean, I didn't have to, but I joined late just because of mix up with the links, and it was too late to buy a ticket. So I have to sort that one out. But anyway, but so I heard most of Sarah's presentation, I think, and great to see those before and after photos. I would love to know more about those, and also just, yeah, to see you all.
Awesome, thanks, Dee Dee. And then just so everybody knows, all the links are posted on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website. So even if you don't register, they are up there for future events. Just
okay. I couldn't find them there, but we'll figure it out next time.
It's on the event page for this event. Sharon, coming to you. Hi, Sharon.
Hi. I love the thought of moving us further and further toward resilient farming. I have a garden that I've been trying to keep going, thinking of ancestors. My father's been farming it since the 70s, and the soil is wonderful. And I love that concept of moving that forward to those future people. Just planted peas today. And I just think the Upper Valley is ripe for lots of big steps forward this way. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. Stephen, I am coming back to you. I think I unmuted the correct one.
Hello.
Yes.
Well, again, just an honor to be here, and just a shout out to both Dee Dee Pershouse and Grace Krishini, great, wonderful lights for all of us in the soil advocates world, and their work is the work that the next generation, will be standing on the shoulders of. So, but thank you to everyone today.
Thank you, Stephen. Whoever is in the Springfield UU Meeting House, we're coming to you.
Hi, it's Debbie Diego. Account. So yeah, I'm so grateful to everyone who's worked on the soil series and managed to convert it from a in-person event to Zoom. And the presentations today were outstanding. The knowledge and skills and experience of folks in the Upper Valley, not just Sarah and Stephen, but many other people who are on this call and others who aren't. It's overwhelming. And I have to say that having just seen Planet of the Humans a couple nights ago, this was so great because it just was really hopeful, and that we don't have to build these strange towers in the desert and these, you know, square mile solar farms and all this. We can just heal things with the soil, which I already knew, but to see those before and after pictures and all the examples was really, really hopeful. And thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Tina, we are headed to you now.
Hey, I really appreciated both of the talks, and especially since I'm in the middle of what I call tree planting season, which is one of my favorite parts of the year. I really appreciated your remark, Sarah, where you said that, you know, just put stuff in the ground, take chances, don't worry about whether it's going to work. Because a lot of the stuff I plant is kind of marginal for this zone, but eventually with the changing climate, I figure some of those are actually going to work and be helpful. So that was a great pumping the arm. So thanks for that. And also for the idea that resilient isn't the end point, that anti-fragility is sort of a really helpful reframe. So I'll be thinking about that afterwards. So thanks very much for both of you.
Thanks, Tina. Trevor, now it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Sarah. I really appreciated your presentations. And I guess I had a couple of thoughts I wanted to share. I'm really passionate about regenerative food forests, and I'm working on a regenerative community garden space in Fairleigh. So if anybody is in the area and interested in that, you can contact me. And I also work on a farm in White River Junction, a small organic CSA farm. And, you know, both I do out of interest for, you know, contributing to food security, and neither can actually really put a dent in, I think, the like looming food insecurity that this crisis is bringing to the Upper Valley and the whole world. And so with that in mind, you know, I think about this reintegrating humans back into nature that we spoke a little bit about. And, you know, just real quickly, because of the conflict and the trauma of our cultural past, like Kat and others have referenced, I think that learning to sustain and be sustained by place, you know, reintegrating with nature is multi-generational work. We can't do it alone or in a single lifetime because of all of the cultural effects on our perspectives. And so we need an unprecedented land coordination effort between farms, between gardeners, consumers, and we need a multi-generational effort. You know, and I'm not talking about them, the politicians, or the Green New Deal. I'm saying we need to do this in our communities.
Thank you. Robin, it's your turn.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I want to really thank you all for putting this together. I've been following this forum for a while, since some of the presentations last year, actually one on permaculture that really, really inspired me. And it's a little overwhelming, a lot of the posts and the reading, and so I really appreciated the Sarah's sort of focus right at the beginning on that it's a mindset, and a lot of the terminology of regeneration and exploitation, the anti-fragility, those are sort of themes that have been on my mind about a lot of systems. So for me, this was both sort of the bigger framework of trying how do we get from what we've always known and how we did it to a different framework. And I really loved the way it was sort of broken down in these step-by-step pieces that my mind was kind of jumping around between energy and the financial system and, you know, all the sort of systems. So to have, and I think that connected for me with that permaculture presentation of this focus on the soil. So I loved what she said about the soil being the key to preventing conflict and unrest in in all our systems. So I took away a lot of little details, and I'm actually just putting together a garden for my granddaughter. That's we're just making our first little raised bed. So there was very direct information that I can apply right away. So thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you, Robin. I believe that I got everyone. If you think that I'm wrong, please let me know. Just wave your arms on your video or something. But I just want to say I am super grateful for this community and for you guys to keep showing up. I know screen time in these days is excessive. And so I'm glad that you who are still even on this call found this a good use of your time. Incredibly grateful for that, because these have been definitely labors of love. I will say on the kind of theme of just kind of getting stuff in the ground, I completely agree. This is my first year of starting my own seeds. I've farmed before, but never actually started seeds inside, and it has been fascinating to learn how different things grow and how they grow even if some days you forget to water them. So I just wanted to say thanks for being a community, and I'm so grateful. I also just want to say that next time, which is only 8 days away from now, so a week and a day, our next event is on Monday, May 4th from 5:30 to 8. It is called Revolutionary Resilience, Creating a Different Future. And we're gonna have a lot more time for discussion about what really is going on in the Upper Valley and how all of the people on the call can share knowledge and experience. And so I really hope you guys will join us for a more dynamic conversation. I think there's pros and cons to lots of presentations, and there's pros and cons to lots of discussion. And so that 5th event will be a lot of discussion. And then just so you all know, the 6th event, we will have a panel of farmers who are going to talk to us, a diversity of farmers. And so I hope you guys will join us then as well. And then Kat, it looks like you want to say something to wrap up. And then I'll say thank you again and hope to see you all next time.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Yeah, of course, I always want to say something. The next event is featuring Mindy Blank. I don't know if you all know who she is, but Mindy runs the Community Resilience Organizations of Vermont. She's an incredible soul, an incredible speaker, super passionate, and I'm proud to say that I work with her on a number of projects, including most recently, we're launching a mobilization now of the Upper Valley food security and food sovereignty needs now through the COVID time and into the future. And some of the people here are on that group, and everyone is welcome. And Trevor, I got to send you an invite for sure. If anyone here is interested in being a part of that evolving group, we're really just trying to connect the dots of what is already happening to reduce redundancies, improve efficiencies, and feed our neighbors and provide medicine. And I noticed tonight that housing came up in the chat too, and land access. So those are all really important. Now is the time to do that. So please be in touch. Whatever we develop here in the Upper Valley will be shared outwardly, transparently. We want to help build community and food resilience and sovereignty in all communities. And it takes every one of us to do that in every way that we are able to contribute. Thank you all so much for being here. It means so much to us that you attend. We know there's tons of free webinar stuff, and we're all super screened out. So thanks a lot. These recordings are all available on the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website. We have a YouTube channel. We've done our best to try and put the word out, but with all the stresses we're dealing with, our advertising hasn't been as good. So please help us get the word out so that our 5th and 6th events are really well populated. And please also fill out our survey, which Lauren, do you want to throw that in the chat? We have a survey. It really helps us to improve what we're doing so that we can continue to bring you good programming and ask the better questions together and work on how we can collectively work together to answer those questions and meet the needs of ourselves and our ancestors and our future generations. Thanks so much. I think we're saying goodbye, Lauren. Is that right? We're done? Lauren's the boss.
We're saying goodbye. Links are in the chat. The chat will go away, but the links will be on the website tomorrow. So
thank you. Air hugs, everybody.